Yes, well, Portugal was one of the last colonial powers in Africa, and they were refusing to relinquish their domination of Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, and the war was still being waged when we first went to Mozambique. The Portuguese were still there, but talking to the Portuguese officers at the time, they realised the war was unwinnable. I mean, Portugal was a small country and it was losing a lot of its soldiers, and particularly its young officers who came from often middle-class families. And so the losing war in the Portuguese colonies had a repercussion back home in Portugal, because families were losing their sons. They were almost all of sons. There weren't any women in the army, I don't think, in Portugal at the time. And so they wanted to stop to the colonial war. It was also becoming a total drain on the country's economy and the finances. And so there was an increasing feeling among young officers in the Portuguese army, we've got to stop this. There's no way we can continue. We're not going to win this war. We don't want to win this war. These countries need their independence. But we have to change things back home. And so it was a group of politicized young officers who then made the coup in April 1974, which overthrew the old fascist regime of Caetano. Immediately, you know, it took everybody by surprise. I mean, even the Americans and the CIA didn't know it was going to happen, because Portugal was the headquarters of NATO, Southern Atlantic headquarters of NATO, and they didn't dream that there was going to be a revolution in Portugal, and one which looked as if it was going to be a socialist revolution. But immediately we heard about the officers and the successful coup. 2 or 3 days later, we just decided quickly to move there to film, because we knew this was in terms of Europe quite a significant change in the history of the continent, or could be, and it was certainly an important event which needed covering. So we just packed our bags and went without any contacts or anything. Well, that was one of the most exciting experiences I've ever had, because to really experience what was a real revolution is not given one very often in life, and it reminded me very much of John Reed's description of the revolution in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, because it was just such an exciting time. Everything was happening so fast. We didn't put the camera down from morning till midnight, basically, and we didn't know where to turn, because suddenly people experienced this freedom, which they didn't expect either. I mean, you know, this was achieved by this small group of young officers, but the population in Portugal had lived under fascism for 40 years, and they never dreamt that they were going to experience this sense of new freedom. So the prisons were opened overnight. Political prisoners were released. Their families came there to greet them. They were crying. They were embracing each other. Women and men and children were going around putting carnations in the barrels of the guns of the soldiers. You know, that's where it got its name from, the Carnation Revolution, because the soldiers were now not seen as the enemy who would shoot them, but they were there to protect the revolution and protect the people. Trade unions, for instance, for the first time were able to organise freely. So you had railway workers getting together organising, you had ceramic workers getting together and organising, ship workers getting together, and there were meetings happening everywhere. Then political parties were being formed. Groups in the houses were forming to make sure they could stay without being evicted, particularly in the countryside, because Portugal was a very agricultural country still. The peasants were taking over the farms and started running the farms themselves. And I mean, for us, what was fascinating, you know, we went into the headquarters of the secret services there, PD, which had been responsible for oppressing and suppressing any progressive political organisation, and particularly the Communist Party, of course. Many of its members, I think the Central Committee at the time had about 300 years in prison between them. You know, they'd been in prison for many, many years. And you could see the torture chambers beneath the headquarters. There was still an half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table of the chief of police. You know, he'd fled immediately overnight, and things were still the same there. So you felt you'd arrived at almost a magical moment, that it had been fixed in time. And we went with this BBC correspondent to the PD headquarters, where they had all the files as well on all the subversives as they saw it. And he found his own file in there. You know, he was on their list, as were several others, friends of ours who were there. So that was very interesting. And then we visited the prisons and talked to the young officers who were now in charge of the prisons, and now in the prison cells were the former Secret Service people, you know, still as arrogant as ever, surprisingly, because they were being treated very well. They weren't being, tortured or put in chains. You know, they could move around the prison without too much of a problem, but they were under arrest nevertheless. I mean, I'm sure most of them were allowed out without any repercussions shortly afterwards, but at that time they were under arrest. Well, exactly. No one knew what would happen. As I say, because it was a very loose grouping of young officers who suddenly found themselves in charge of a country. They'd never planned it in that way either. They just wanted to overthrow the dictatorship. But suddenly you had this group of officers who were in charge of the country and had to run the country in the interim before elections could take place. And they were a mixed group. There were several communists, Marxists, progressives, liberals. So it wasn't easy to maintain a consensus. And then you had the political parties in the country. You had the Communist Party, which was well established because it was the only party that had survived. It was still illegal, but it was still working in the country. So it had a head start of all the others. And most of the other parties were formed at the time. Suddenly, you know, there was representatives of the businessmen or the agricultural oligarchs, and even the Socialist Party, which was formed largely with help from West Germany and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, that gave quite a lot of money and support to Suarez, the leader of the socialists then. And it was hoped that there would be probably an alliance between the communists and the socialists to form a proper socialist government in Portugal. And to begin with, it looked a distinct possibility, but I think Suarez was lent on very, very heavily by the West Germans particularly. I mean, Willy Brandt went out there to visit him while we were there. We actually managed to film him coming to the airport, and he was quite surprised because it was obviously supposed to be a secret visit, and there was no other press there. And then the Americans really sent in their forces big time. Their new ambassador was Frank Carlucci, who had bloody hands from Latin America. He was their frontline man to fight communism, and they were determined that there would be no socialist government in Portugal. And they started working then very fast, building up their own right-wing parties, blackening the communists, and pretending there's going to be another armed coup by the communists. There was a lot of scaremongering, and people were, they'd had no experience of democracy. As I say, 40 years of fascism, without proper parties to vote for, and no free political discussion. So people were looking for something they could cling on to, something they could believe in, something they could have faith in. And so yes, it was all very flexible, very flexible. We filmed massive meetings of Communist Party meetings, joint Communist Party Socialist meetings, and meetings with the armed forces. And there were tens of thousands of people there. And you got the feeling that everybody was behind the Communist Party, which of course they weren't. It was a divided nation. And although Lisbon was particularly, it was an industrial city, so it was particularly progressive. But in the hinterlands, and particularly in the north of Portugal, it was still very rural, strongly Catholic, and very backward, and reactionary. And the church, of course, was very anti-communist in Portugal. The funny thing is, as I said, we arrived there, I think it was 3 days after the coup took place. There were very few film teams there at all. Or at least we didn't come across them. I mean, as I say, there was so much happening, and so film teams were probably also thinly spread. But I think most mainstream teams came out quite a bit later. I mean, we covered the Portuguese Revolution for I think a year and a half. We went there several times, and I actually stayed for 6 months there, covering the whole development of the revolution. But we had very little contact with other film teams. When Zimbabwe had its independence, I mean, there were dozens and dozens of film teams there, and we all stayed in the same hotel basically. And yeah, so you had a lot of contact. You chatted in the bar, and you were all filming the same things. But most of the work we did, we were on our own. We didn't meet any other teams. I mean, like South Africa, for instance. I mean, very few teams went to South Africa. Because again, you had to have permission basically if you wanted to film officially. And the BBC made 1 or 2 films there, but they didn't want to expose apartheid because, you know, they our great leader Margaret Thatcher, Britain, you know, she called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. The ANC was a terrorist organisation. That was the viewpoint. You know, for us it was a liberation organisation, but for them it was a terrorist organisation, and for the Americans as well. So there wasn't much interest in covering the liberation struggle, certainly not.